So, Your Excellency, welcome in France.
Thank you.
And thank you for granting us a bit of your time for this interview.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, first of all, could you briefly introduce yourself and the CMRI for the French-speaking audience?
My name is Bishop Mark Pivarunas. I'm originally from Chicago, Illinois. I was born of a Catholic family, and my parents were very traditional-minded. We wore the scapular of Our Lady, we prayed the rosary, we would go to Mass frequently, especially on Sundays. Every Saturday, our family would, as a family, go to confession. We would frequently visit the cemetery. I had an older brother in the seminary. This is in the 1960s when I was growing up. And after Vatican II, as we know, the radical changes in the Catholic Church took place. In some areas of the United States, they happened more rapidly. So in our particular parish in Chicago, the changes were very rapid and very obvious. And my father was a very traditionally minded Catholic, and he would challenge the priest on the changes in the Mass. When I was in school, I think I was probably 10 years old, the priest came into our classroom to tell us about Vatican II. And he drew a mountain on the board, and he said, on the top of the mountain's heaven, and we're going up the Catholic road. But there are other roads that lead to heaven as well. Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims. And my father was absolutely perplexed. He said, why am I spending money to send you to a Catholic private school when they tell you don't have to be a Catholic? So, as usual, what was typical back then, we looked for a more conservative, more traditional parish. And then we found the Latin Mass again. So when I made my first Holy Communion, it was the Latin Mass, received Holy Communion. But in '69, with the Novus Ordo, it was very obvious to my family something was wrong. We were able to find an older priest up on the north side of Chicago. His name was Father Leonard McNamara, and he offered Mass. It was interesting because the church was packed, and you knew the people knew why they were being present at the Latin Mass, because Father McNamara was in his 80s, his old man, and as he was distributing communion, to help him, some modern priest would come out, but he would go to the Novus Ordo altar to take out the host, and we went to distribute communion. People got up and walked away from him. They wanted to receive only from Father McNamara. So I was able to recognize that I had a vocation in 1974. I was 15 at the time. I joined a seminary, it's a minor seminary, and then I became a religious, and I took my final vows in 1981 in the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen. Now this congregation, Mary Immaculate Queen, was started in 1967, before the Novus Ordo, but after Vatican II. It originally was a part of what was called the Blue Army. It was a organization to promote the message of Our Lady of Fatima. But because of Vatican II and the changes, the Blue Army was going more toward the Novus Ordo, so a group of these people separated and started what was called the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen. And the purpose of the congregation was to have the Latin Mass, the traditional Catholic faith, and promote the message of Our Lady of Fatima. So I took final vows in 1981, and in 1985 I was ordained a priest by Bishop George Musey. Bishop Musey was from the Diocese of Galveston, Texas, and interestingly, he was ordained in the 1950s. But he had a heart attack very early on, so he was on sick leave. And being on sick leave, he was outside of what was happening with the changes in the church. So that when the new Mass came along, he was on sick leave. He did not have to offer the new Mass. He continued offering the Latin Mass. And he had a group in Texas, also a group in Louisiana. And at that time, there were a network of older priests who knew each other communicating in the United States, only offering the Latin Mass, not going along with Vatican II. It's interesting that in many of our Mass centers today, we have over 50 Mass centers in the United States. And many of these Mass centers were begun by older priests. Like in Nebraska, where I'm from, Father Clement Kubish, he had been a priest for over 50 years. He did not go along with the changes of Vatican II, did not go along with the Novus Ordo. So his Archbishop Sheehan, had told him, you either change or you have to get out. Now at this point, he's elderly, he has nothing to fall back on, and the bishop said, if you stay with the diocese, if you go along with the changes in the new Mass, I'll raise your pension, I'll raise your fees. And he answered the bishop, Father Kubish said this, Archbishop, hell is not just for a long time, it's forever. And he walked out. So Father Clement Kubish, his little group of people, after he retired and he eventually died, I took over his group in Omaha, Nebraska. But that's the story of many of our places where we have churches and Mass centers, older priests. They were the pioneers. They were the ones that recognized what was going on, and they preserved the true faith and the true Mass, and then we just picked up from them. There are many other new places that we have. In the 1980s, we were giving lectures around the United States, and we would lecture on the message of Fatima and also the changes in the Catholic Church. And we drew a large number of people. It was very, very successful. The one thing that I regret is that at that time in the 1980s, we did not have as many priests as we have today. Today we have about 30 priests in the United States, and we have about, I'm thinking maybe about 120, 130 religious sisters and brothers. So if we had those numbers in the 1980s, we could have done a lot more work, but we did what we could. I regret that sometimes we would give a lecture. I remember in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. I gave a lecture, there's about 170, 180 people there. And the people were very receptive. They said, what you're saying is true, we know what you're saying is true. This modern Mass is not Catholic anymore, but what do? We didn't have anyone to send. I said, I'll come back in a couple of months. And the look on their face was, we have to go somewhere. So I began to realize it's more important to stay in one area and develop that. So I gave a lecture in Nebraska, in Omaha, Nebraska. We had a very good response. At this time we had no resident priest. So from our headquarters in Spokane, Washington, Mount St. Michael's, every weekend I would fly and have Mass for the people. We had a Mass, maybe about 5 or 6 Mass centers throughout Nebraska. And then eventually after 1 year I became resident in Nebraska, and then we branched out to Kansas, and we continued to go to Minnesota and to Colorado. Then as we had new priests being ordained, we were able to establish. So we have, like I say, over 50 Mass centers in the United States, 30 priests and about 120 religious. Our goal is not only to establish Mass centers so that people can have Mass, regular Mass, the sacraments, but also in more, after the Mass, the idea of having a school. The children are the future of the Church. And I know some parents, their only option is to homeschool, but we have established many schools around the United States, and they're all run by religious. So the sisters, the religious nuns, are teaching the children the faith. And the beautiful thing is that when I was a young priest, some of the people I helped as students, their children go to our school, and then I've had their weddings for their children. So we have, like 2 generations now of Catholics being raised in the faith and passing that on to their children. We have in the United States, like I say, about 30 priests, 120 religious. The bishop who consecrated me, Bishop Carmona, he was ordained in the 1930s, and he fortunately was able to retain his church and continue the Latin Mass, because in Mexico the situation is a little bit different. In the 1920s, the Masonic government of Mexico confiscated the churches and the convents and the seminaries. It's amazing when you go to Mexico, you look at a building and you think it's a convent, you think it's a seminary. It's actually the police station. It's actually a military building because the government just took those away. Now, the government allows, obviously, the practice of the Mass and the sacraments and the faith after, things subsided with the persecution, but they continue to consider that they own those churches. So when Bishop Carmona, he was a pastor of the church Divine Providence Catholic Church in Acapulco, Mexico. When it came to the changes, and his bishop of Acapulco told him to get out, he said, "I'm not going anywhere." And I'm estimating he had, 1,000, 2,000 parishioners, and he would have multiple masses on Sunday, and those parishioners told the bishop, "We're not going anywhere." So the government said, if that's what the people want, he doesn't have to get out of the church. Now, Bishop Carmona, he established, like just in the United States, the older priests established missions and churches. Bishop Carmona did an incredible work throughout Mexico. He began the group called the Trento Priest, and he knew a number of other traditional priests throughout Mexico, and so Bishop Carmona's priests, they were the ones who, once again filled in when these older priests had died. So we have down in Mexico Bishop Martin Davila. I consecrated him in 1999, and he is the Trento priest. There's another group of priests, they're religious, the Carmelites. They're in Guadalajara. They would still want to work with me, so that's fine. I was just down in Mexico for confirmations this past week. We had 100 confirmations, and that might sound like a lot, but in Mexico, it's amazing. They're simple people, but how much the faith is alive and well. It's interesting. After Bishop Carmona died, and I was taking over his place and helping out with confirmations and ordinations, I went to a town called Dos Caminos. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 people there. I get to the entrance of the town. The car pulls out, and the priest says, "You have to get out now. You're going to walk the rest of the way." So it's kind of up onto a hill. There's a big church on the top of the hill. The mayor of the town meets me. There's children dressed in their native garments, and they're like tambourines, and they're shooting off fireworks. And I'm going right down the center of town, and they're throwing confetti, and the people from the windows are waving. The whole town is traditional Catholic. So I asked the priest, I said, "Do the modern Novus Ordo priests come here?" He said, "Yeah. They come once a month for maybe 1 or 2 families in a house." I mean, it's the reverse.
Yes.
But in Mexico, on one occasion, I remember I had, in one ceremony, 450 confirmations, which took a long time. And the Mexican people love photographs. So the photographs took as long as the ceremonies. And there's a saying in Spanish, otra, I mean, another one. And I'm like, I'm just standing there smiling, and they individual, then families, etc. So basically, we have a very strong presence in the United States and in Mexico. The Congrégation of Immaculée, we have priests associated with us in New Zealand, in Canada, in South America, some priests here in Europe. That's why I'm here to provide the sacrament of confirmation. And I'd also like to say briefly that once again, when we look at like the priest in Germany, there was a Bishop Gunther Stork. He was the Sedevacantist bishop who was consecrated, and he was, he passed away, but he was from Munich, and so the priests that I help out there were from Bishop Stork.
The recently issued motu proprio Traditionis Custodes has left many traditional leaning Catholics, which are in union with the Vatican II Church. Well, they are now in great disarray. And how did you react to this event, and what would be your advice for these traditional Catholics who accept Francis as a Pope?
I would hope that they would now begin to recognize the true state of affairs in the church. For a long time, people would try to justify, well, I don't have to worry because I have a Latin Mass. But it's not just the Latin Mass, it's the Catholic faith. They have to come to realize that what happened at Vatican II was not just a change in the Mass. There was a radical change in the doctrines of the faith. And this is the reason why at Vatican II there were conservative cardinals and bishops who opposed the changes. And just very briefly to explain, once again, it's not just the Mass, it's the faith. I would like to get back to the Mass too, because there's a lot of essential points to the Mass. But with regard to the faith, of all the issues, I think prominent, what was the main error of Vatican II is false ecumenism. Pope Pius XI in Mortalium Animos, he condemned false ecumenism. He said true ecumenism is for the Catholic Church to convert the world to Christ, to bring in all those who are not part of the Catholic Church from other religions, from other churches, to unite the world in Christ and in the one true church that he founded. Vatican II contradicted that. In fact, if you look at some of the documents, declaration, one of them is Aetate Nostra, it says, you know, the church looks with esteem upon the Muslims. The Hindus are making a loving, trusting flight to God. The Buddhists can attain supreme enlightenment. Vatican II stated clearly the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is good and holy in these religions. The role of the church now is to acknowledge, preserve, and promote the good in these other religions. That is utterly preposterous. Christ's command to his apostles, go teach all nations, teach them to observe everything I've commanded you. I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except through Jesus. Now, I'd like to share with you just a quick story, and that is Father Clement Kubish in Omaha, Nebraska, when he was expelled from the diocese by his bishop, that same bishop I had to deal with when I was a young priest. So we were going to build a church in Omaha, and it made the front page of the newspaper. You know, it was very much controversial. Who's this priest building a church and they're not associated with the diocese? So the reporter asked me, he said, listen, I'm not a Catholic. I don't understand. You say you're Catholic. The Archbishop says he's Catholic. What's the problem? What's the difference? I said, I believe that Christ founded the Catholic Church and that the Catholic Church is the one true church of Christ. The Archbishop doesn't believe that anymore. He went to the Archbishop and said, that priest is saying you don't believe that the Catholic Church is the one true church of Christ. What do you have to say about that? Now, he was in a dilemma, because if he says he believes the Catholic Church is the one true church of Christ, his ecumenical endeavors go right out the window. Because they get together, the Lutherans and the Methodists and all the other Protestants, so he would be in trouble. So he said, well, I don't want to get into theology in the newspaper. He dodged it was a yes or a no. Did you change or you not change? But I think that's the most important issue, is the false ecumenism. And because of false ecumenism, Paul VI wanted to alter the Mass. And interestingly, as I'm sure you can see from the photographs, there were 6 Protestants from Taizé, France, who came and did they were a part of the commission to alter the Mass. And when they were done with that commission to make the Novus Ordo, those same Protestants, Max Thurian was one of them, he said, now we, Lutherans, can use the same Mass as the Catholics because it's not a sacrifice. So we have to look at it in this sense. It's not just a matter of the Mass, it's a matter of the Church. Now, for those who were going to the Latin Mass and thinking, I'm happy, I have the Latin Mass, I don't need to worry about anything. No, the issue is deeper. They have to realize the Church has been infiltrated from within, as had been foretold by the Masons some 200 years ago. They said that they would infiltrate within the Church and destroy it from within. So the changes at Vatican II with regard to false ecumenism, religious indifferentism, religious liberty. Many of these are Masonic principles, etc. The problem is what's going on in the church itself. It's not just the Mass. So hopefully they can come to realize that what Francis has externally done is really a part of a plan to alter the Catholic Church. So the false ecumenism, and now he wants to even more promote what they call the ordinary Mass, the Novus Ordo, and exclude the Latin Mass. So I think that it's time for them to wake up to the reality that Francis is not a representative of Christ. Francis is not someone trying to promote the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith. And neither were his predecessors, all those coming from Vatican II. They, in reality, are destroying the Church. Another good example, which is very clear-cut, in the traditional Code of Canon Law, Canon 731, it was forbidden for Catholic priests to give the sacraments to heretics and schismatics, even if they asked in good faith. They would have to first abjure their error and come back to the faith. John Paul II came out with a new Code of Canon Law in 1983, and the new canon, Canon 844, allows for communion to Protestants, which is preposterous. And not only that, but John Paul II extended it to saying, at a mixed marriage, when a Catholic marries a Protestant, a Eucharistic sharing is possible. We all know, not too many years ago, Francis came out with his Amoris Laetitia, his apostolic exhortation, which even modern clergy are recognizing contains heresy. The idea that those who are living in adultery can go to Holy Communion, and they, in their critique of the Amoris Laetitia, they try to say, well, maybe he's making a mistake in good faith. That is preposterous, that the man who's supposed to be Christ's representative, the vicar of Christ, supposed to be the Pope, he doesn't know the sixth commandment of God? I mean, this is ridiculous. But it's also like with the false ecumenism. False ecumenism promotes the idea that, we should recognize the good in all religions. Well, where's the first commandment? I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. I've got to tell you a quick story. I received a phone call from a reporter in Australia. His name was Andrew Rebel, and he was a reporter for Inside the Vatican, a magazine. So he calls me up, and he must not know the time zones, because it's like 5 o'clock in the morning. I wake up and I get this phone call, and I can recognize his Australian accent, and he had been emailing me saying, come back to the church. You're outside the church. So I just asked him, I said, Andrew, let me ask you one question. Would you ask a Hindu to pray for you? And he got real quiet. And I said, come on, Andrew, yes or no? Would you ask a Hindu to pray for you? He said, real quickly, no. I said, why not? I said, you don't ask a Hindu to pray for you because he doesn't pray to the true God. He has false gods. I said, how does it make sense that John Paul II and later on Benedict XVI, they had these Assisi meetings where they called all the religions of the world to Assisi to pray to their false gods for world peace. What they're saying in reality is, I think your prayers have benefit. Pray to your false gods for world peace. And I want you to do this within the Catholic Church. Needless to say, I never heard back from Andrew Rebel again. So, but it's not complicated. I also have to smile. I was talking to someone who was going to the Indult Mass, the Latin Mass. And we were talking about the situation of the church. And he made a comment. He said, what makes me fearful about what you're saying is that it's too logical. It makes too much sense. I said, well, what's dangerous about that? The truth is something that you can see. It's not something that you have to try to, deceive people. The truth, it shines at you. Because what is truth? Truth, logical truth, is the conformity of our minds to reality, the way things are. Do I like the situation of the church? No. Do I like to see people leaving the church? No. Do I like to see what happens in these Novus Ordo supposed masses, all the irreverences and the strange and absurd things going on? No, it's disturbing. I have to tell you, the first parish I was talking about, where, you know, the priest drew the mountain on the board and said that's heaven and all that. That school had 1,000 students. We had from 2nd grade to 8th grade, there was 1,000 Catholic kids going to that school. All run by nuns, there may be even 2 or 3 lay people. But that was the situation in the 1960s at the time of Vatican II. Things were flourishing. And we had 500 families in our parish. And you can go 1 mile away and there would be another Catholic church, another parish, just as big school. Things were flourishing. It's interesting. I don't know what it is the situation in France, but in the United States, in 1965, there were 113,000 religious sisters teaching in schools. Vatican II came along, and they changed everything. So they disrupted religious life by telling religious, in the spirit of Vatican II, you need a renewal. You need to experiment with new things. They didn't experiment. They didn't need to experiment. Things were working. Things were flourishing. So what was experimenting? You don't want to live in a convent? You get an apartment. You don't want to pray in common? You don't have to pray together as sisters. You don't want to wear the religious habit? You don't have to wear the religious habit. Within 30 years, from 1965 to 1995, the number of sisters dropped to 13,000. They lost 100,000 sisters. That means schools closed, in all these facilities like orphanages and geriatric centers for old people. What the sisters did was just collapsed. It's horrible. I read of an article. Do you have Time magazine here in
Sure.
Yeah. In 1969, Time magazine wrote an article on the seminary, the Jesuit seminary in Rome called the Gregorian Institute. And the title of it was Liberating the Greg. So he goes through a history that St. Ignatius Loyola founded the Greg in the 1500s, and the seminarians all had to wear cassocks, and there was a very strict seminary, but it produced popes, bishops, theologians. I mean, it was just a real, how do you say, bulwark of Catholicism. Vatican II changed all that. Paul VI got rid of the conservative cardinal. He put in this liberal sociologist priest. I think his name was Hervé Carvier or something like that. He was from France, or from French Canada. And he made the seminary co-educated. So he brought 190-something women into the seminary. Then the seminarians did not have to wear their cassocks. Then they introduced alcohol into the cafeteria. Then they introduced pornography in the small theater they had. And then they started inviting professors from Protestant, churches to come and lecture and teach there. They could also include a rabbi. I mean, is it any wonder? Now, our main headquarters at Mount St. Michael's, Spokane, it housed about 450 Jesuits. 450 Jesuits were housed there. In fact, after World War II, there was an influx of vocations, so they added an addition to Mount St. Michael's. It was built in 1917. By 1977, 60 years later, they put it up for sale. No vocations. We bought the place from the Jesuits, and when we moved in, there's probably, in this huge, massive building, 20 Jesuits left. Older priests and religious. I mean, and they just walked away from it. They left all the beds, all the blankets, all the sheets, all the furniture, the library. They just everything. Just walked away from it. It was just. It makes you wonder. Can't they see, as Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them? I mean, when seminaries close, when schools close, when convents close, when the religious numbers of religious drop, there's something wrong here. So for those who have been going to like the indult mass and now it's being taken away from them, I think they need to realize the problem is much deeper than just Latin mass as opposed to the vernacular Novus Ordo. It's much deeper than that. But even actually, when we think of the vernacular Novus Ordo, even that should be a contradiction to them. How can the Catholic Church approve of a so-called Mass, which by definition is a Lutheran Mass? The Novus Ordo, in its preface, it's number 7 of the preface, says that the Mass is the gathering together of the people of God with the priest presiding to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst. That definition has nothing to do with the real definition of the Mass. The renewal of Calvary, the renewal of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. No mention of sacrifice. The priest is just an overseer. It's the people gathered together, according to the Novus Ordo definition. It's the people gathered together that bring about the presence of Christ, not the priest consecrating, not the transubstantiation. And if you look through the Novus Ordo, by and large, so much was taken out of it that you lose the sense of Christ's real presence. And that's the reason why, I don't know what it is in France, but they've taken polls in the United States. I mean, large numbers of supposed Catholics do not believe in Christ's presence in the Eucharist anymore. It's just not there. So we live in some very challenging times, but let's not think that these were not foretold by Christ and by what we read in sacred scripture. St. Paul, in his second epistle to Thessalonians, chapter 2, talks about the apostasy, the great falling away. He said, the day of the Lord, the second coming of Christ, will not happen till the apostasy occurs first. And the man of sin, the Antichrist, he will sit in the temple of God and give himself as if he were God. Now, I began to think about this. I remember in our parish where the first beginnings of the Novus Ordo, they put up the table and they took out the altar and they put the chairs right behind the table. So first, psychologically, when a person comes into the church, you would genuflect ordinarily to the tabernacle, to the Blessed Sacrament. No longer. The tabernacle is not the center, the focus. You have the chairs where man is facing man. It's very remarkable. And then the idea of standing for communion, then communion in the hand, then lay people distribute communion. And I know of so many terrible stories. I remember hearing a story in a small town in Nebraska where some of our faithful, they said that friends of theirs, one of the family members was sick at home. So they went up for the Novus Ordo, for the communion. They go like this. They get 2 hosts. They put one in the mouth, put the other in their pocket to bring it home for the one that was sick. And I'm like, no concept of Christ, real presence there. So, but like I say, the new regulations of Francis are just showing what his real intent is. He wants to obviously destroy anything traditional within the church. And if they haven't figured it out by now, I hope that this is a realization that he is not Christ's representative. Jesus said to Peter, whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loose in heaven. And the things that are being done in the modern church in the name of Christ are contradicting what the popes have taught in the past, contradicting what the council of the church, especially the Council of Trent, they're contradicting what Christ taught too. And you know, when we're talking about divine law, divine revelation, these men are contradicting divine law, divine revelation. That is not representing Christ. It is not being bound in heaven. These men have no authority to do that. They are not the authority they claim to be.
Thank you, Excellency. So now I can't help asking you if the CMRI has some plans to spread further in Europe, especially maybe in France.
Well, this is our desire. We have seminarians coming in from different parts of the world. So we have had seminarians from New Zealand, from Mexico, from South America, and from Europe as well. We have a seminarian coming in from Poland, and when our seminary is able to take foreign students, and when they get ordained, after they've had some type of a tutelage under an older priest, we can send them back. We have in Germany one of the seminarians who went to our seminary. He's a priest now, but he is working with Father Riesing as Father Johannes Heine. And then there's Father Joseph Weisensteiner. He's working with Father Amar Hambovich in north of Venice and Treviso, Italy. He came to the seminary as well. So as seminarians come and get ordained from their, from the country where they're from, we can certainly send them back. I'd like to tell you an interesting story about the seminary. When we get seminarians from all over the world, you see two things. How on a natural level, how different we are. But on a supernatural level, we're all the same. And I experience this Catholicity. If I go to Mexico or South America, or I go to like England or New Zealand or Australia, I come to, you know, Europe, people are different on a natural level, but on a supernatural level, we're all the same. But I heard an interesting story from a seminarian. He said that there were Americans, French, Germans, and Italians all together, and they're having dinner in a seminary cafeteria. And the French were very proper with chicken. They're eating chicken. So they'd cut their chicken, eat it, take the napkin, wipe their mouth. They never touched a chicken at all. The Americans would grab the chicken with their hands and eat it right from their hands. And the French were saying, whispering, these Americans are barbarians. And the Americans understood that, and they're saying to lick their fingers too. So it's like, on a natural level, we're really different, but on a supernatural level, we're all the same. But it's amusing to see this, you know, and it's wonderful to think that was Christ's intention. Each country retains its uniqueness. I mean, and that's what makes life so wonderful, so beautiful, is that people are so different, and there's this variety. Yet when it comes to the supernatural, there's this unity. And I have to tell you, when I meet people in South America, and I meet people from other parts of the world, young families just trying to raise their kids in the Catholic faith. Obviously, they have different customs, different language, different, you know, cuisine, all that is different. But they're all trying to do the same thing. And you talk to them for just a little while, it's almost like they're family. It's almost like I've known these people all my life. It's because that's the beauty of our Catholic faith. It unites everybody throughout the world. So getting back to the idea of what can be done in France, we do have a seminarian, Clement, from here. You know, he's advancing to the priesthood, and it's a slow process, but it builds slowly but surely. And you know, that's exactly how things began in the United States. We continue to spread out, and now we have quite a network of mass centers and schools. And the beautiful thing too is that we need to get vocations. And our Lord said, the harvest indeed is great, but the laborers are few. His answer is, pray the Lord of the harvest. Most of our vocations come from our schools, both to the seminary and also to the convent. You know, the young men having association with priests and with the seminarians, they want to be a priest, or they think they might want to be a priest, and they give it a try. Young ladies, they're associated with the sisters. They want to be a part of that religious life. Excuse me. So that's the point. I think we need to pray for vocations, and not only that, but also do our best to try to spread the word and be ready with things that people can see, like what you're doing right now. It's important. I think, you know, maybe in another time or era, people were more apt to read. But with this technology we have today, people don't really want to read. They want to just see something quickly and have it digested. So this is good.
Sure. So finally, Your Excellency, would you have some general advice for the French traditional Catholics regarding the faith, or maybe even regarding the, I don't know if you heard about it, but the current events? There are a lot of protests right now in France because of the vaccine mandates. Mm-hmm. So would you have some advice, especially for the Catholics?
Well, so getting back to his question about the situation in the world today, for sure, the COVID-19 is a real thing. There are people that die, but I think, unfortunately, it's being exaggerated. We need to protect the old people and those who have a pre-existing medical condition. But for most people, young people and people in good health, they may get it, and at most it's going to be like a flu. They're going to have symptoms of headache, fever, fatigue, achiness. some people have COVID and don't even realize it. They're asymptomatic. They don't even have it. So, but unfortunately, this is being used worldwide to create something that I believe the globalist would like to do, is to reestablish the world. They call it the Great Reset. And this is the worrisome thing, because countries will lose their sovereignty, their independence, to a global government. And the idea of global government, global economy, etc., this doesn't bode well at all. In fact, this is all being, to me, established on something that is basically contrary to nature and to the how Christ wanted to establish things in His church. Each country is unique. Each country is different, and each country needs to govern itself, and not just some world bureaucracy that's going to dictate how you're going to live and what you're going to do. It takes away people's rights. It takes away people's freedoms. Now, the dangerous thing is that they can use this to prohibit people from going to church, from people from worshiping. They can control people. So I think the COVID thing is a real disease, but it's being exaggerated to the point where protect the old people, protect the people with medical conditions, but for most people, they're going to get the COVID. They're going to build an immunity, and they're going to be fine. I tested positive for the antibodies, so I know, I could remember back in November I was sick. I had COVID, and I have the antibodies, so I built an immunity to it. And doctors will tell you your immunity is the best thing you can have for it. You know, not a vaccination, and even a vaccination is experimental. And I've heard many controversial things. There are doctors on both sides, some saying vaccination is good, some saying vaccination is bad, but what is bothersome is that the doctors who are being critical of the vaccination, they're being deplatformed, they're being silenced. Why? You have something to hide? What's this all? What is this all about? And Father, you had a question about the magisterium.
Is there something to say to people in that field,
well,
concerning the rules, the how to do?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to remind ourselves.
I was asked that question, and well, I know how to answer.
Yes, I think we need to remind ourselves that as Christ founded the Catholic Church has the four marks: one, Holy, Catholic, Apostolic. But it has also the attributes. It's indefectible. It will last to the end of time. It is infallible, and it also has authority. This is the church as Christ founded it. So I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that when we look at the marks of the church and the attributes of the church, we can recognize the modern conciliar, Novus Ordo, Vatican II church. That's not the Catholic Church anymore. It's not. Francis is not a true pope. In fact, it's a matter of divine law, God's law, that heretics, public or manifest heretics, cannot be elected to the papacy. And number two, if someone is a true pope, he's not impeccable. He can commit sin, and if he commits the sin of heresy, he deposes himself. That's divine law, and that is the point that I think is critical to remind people who are not sure about what the status of Francis is or John Paul II was. Divine law, God's law, forbids that a manifest or public heretic can be the head of the church. He cannot be elected to the head of the church, and if he is the head of the church, if he becomes a public heretic, he's no longer the pope. Now, people like to confuse this issue by saying, well, they try to say, well, what about material heresy and formal heresy? No. Doctors of the church, theologians, and even Pope Innocent III, they say that a manifest heretic, he deposes himself. And the interesting thing is that they look at it like St. Robert Bellarmine. He said a manifest heretic ceases to be pope, if he was the pope. Saint Francis de Sales says the same thing. Saint Alphonsus Liguori, canonists say the same thing, because of the nature of the church. The church is a visible society where we recognize who's a member, who's not, by not only baptism, but as St. Robert Bellarmine says, by baptism and by the public profession of the faith. That's how you know someone's a member of the church. They never use formal heretic. They always use manifest heretic, public heretic, notorious heretic. Why? Because the Pope himself, by his public heresy, falls away from the faith. And if it wasn't, if there was any doubts in people's mind before, in the past, with Francis, it should be especially clear, this man is not a Catholic. The things that he's saying and doing, not just in matters of faith, like false ecumenism, religious liberty, but even more so now with regard to morality. I mean, he seems to recognize and invite transgenders to the Vatican, and who am I to judge, homosexuals? I mean, Scripture is very clear about that. It's interesting. You would not know this from France, but the United States, there is an outdoor show, and the gentleman, he likes to shoot ducks. He likes a duck hunt. So he has long hair, long beard. He looks really scary, and he looks very rough, but he also is Christian. And he publicly stated that marriage is between a man and a woman, not two men, not two women, and he said that's like an abomination. So everyone, the media attacked him, etc., etc. Around the same time, Francis was saying, who am I to judge? So I'm thinking, this hillbilly, you know what a hillbilly is? Yes. This hillbilly, this country bumpkin, knows the law of God, and the man who's supposed to be the Pope doesn't. This is absurd.
Yes, indeed. So I don't know if you have another question, Father? Okay, I'm done. So. Well, thank you once again for your time, Your Excellency.
Gladly.
And thank you for your most comforting presence here in France.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless you.